Hi, my name is Elena Rodriguez, and 3 months ago, my parents cut me off completely for marrying a construction worker from the wrong side of town. They called it protecting the family reputation. Last week, they received an eviction notice for their $1 million estate. What they don't know is that I'm their new landlord, and I've been quietly buying up their entire neighborhood for the past 5 years. Now they're begging for more time to pay rent they can't afford on a house they thought they owned. Before we dive into this story, I want to know something from you. Drop a comment below and tell me what time you're watching this and where you're from. Because this story is about more than just money and family drama. It's about what happens when people judge your worth by someone else's paycheck, and how sometimes the very thing they use to dismiss you becomes the foundation of your power. The call came on a Wednesday morning while I was reviewing property acquisition reports in my home office. My phone buzzed with a number I hadn't seen in 8 months. My mother's voice came through shaky and small, nothing like the commanding tone she'd used when she told me I was throwing my life away on a man with dirt under his fingernails. "Elena, sweetheart," she said, and I could hear the forced sweetness that meant she needed something. "I hope you're doing well. Your father and I have been thinking about you so much lately." I set down my coffee and leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the construction crew working on my newest property acquisition just 2 blocks from where I grew up. The irony wasn't lost on me that half the crew were guys Miguel had served with, men my parents would probably cross the street to avoid. "What do you need, Mom?" I asked, cutting through the small talk. 8 months of silence teaches you not to waste time on pleasantries. There was a pause, then that nervous laugh she used to do when I was a kid, and she was about to ask me to lie to Dad about something. "Well, we're having some financial difficulties. Nothing serious, just a temporary setback. Your father's investments haven't performed as expected, and we thought maybe you could help us out. Just until we get back on our feet." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I pulled up the file I'd been building for the past 2 years. Highland Estates Property Management LLC, my company. The one that now owned 17 properties in Westbrook Heights, including the house my parents had lived in for the past 15 years. "How much do you need?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I'd seen their financial records when I bought their mortgage from the bank. $68,000 in credit card debt. A second mortgage they'd taken out to maintain their lifestyle when Dad's consulting firm started failing. Property taxes 3 months behind. $50,000 would help tremendously, she said quickly. "We can pay you back once the market turns around. You know we're good for it." Good for it. The same woman who told me I was settling when I married Miguel because he didn't have a college degree. The same woman who said Miguel would drag me down because he worked with his hands instead of sitting behind a desk. The same woman who refused to come to our wedding because she was too embarrassed to explain to their friends why their daughter was marrying beneath her station. "Mom," I said carefully, "do you remember what you said to me the last time we spoke?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Elena, that was months ago. We were all upset. Things were said that—" "You told me I was dead to you," I interrupted, my voice steady. "You said that if I married that Mexican construction worker, I shouldn't bother coming home for Christmas or calling myself your daughter anymore. Those were your exact words." "We were protecting you," she said, her voice getting that sharp edge it always had when she was cornered. "You were throwing away everything we'd worked for, everything we'd given you. A good education, opportunities, connections. And for what? A man who could barely afford to take you to dinner somewhere decent?" I pulled up another file on my computer, the property deed for 1247 Millbrook Avenue. Their address. Purchased 6 months ago from Westbrook Community Bank for $800,000, well below market value because of their impending foreclosure. They had no idea. "Tell me, Mom, exactly what did you and Dad work for? What did you give? Me? Specifically?" "We gave you everything," she said, her voice rising. "Private schools, college tuition, that car for your 16th birthday. We gave you a life most people could only dream of. I scrolled through my files. 22,000 for 4 years at Sacred Heart Academy. 45,000 for my undergraduate degree at Portland State. The car was a used Honda Civic with 120,000 miles on it, bought for $6,000 from Dad's friend who was upgrading. Generous, but hardly everything most people could only dream of. What she wasn't mentioning was the GI Bill that paid for my master's degree, the VA loan that helped me buy my first investment property, the leadership training and discipline I'd learned in the Army that taught me how to manage money, assess risk, and build something from nothing. The same Army they'd begged me not to join because it wasn't appropriate for someone of my background. Mom, I have a question for you, I said, opening my laptop to the Highland Estates portfolio. When you think about Miguel, what exactly do you see? Elena, I don't want to fight about this again. I'm not fighting, I'm asking. When you look at my husband, what do you see? She sighed, that long-suffering sound she made when she thought I was being deliberately difficult. I see a man who works construction, Elena. I see someone who didn't go to college, who doesn't understand the kind of life you were raised to expect. I see someone who can't provide for you the way you deserve. I clicked through the photos Miguel had sent me that morning from the job site. He was wearing his work boots and hard hat, dirt on his hands, standing next to the foundation of what would become a 12-unit apartment complex. Our apartment complex, the third building in our growing portfolio. What you see, I said, is a man who started his own construction company at 25. A man who employs 18 people and has never missed payroll in 7 years. A man who saved every penny from his Army deployment to buy equipment and start building something real. A man who taught me how to read architectural plans and spot properties with good bones. A man who works 60-hour weeks so we can reinvest every dollar into growing our business. Elena, that's not the point. No, Mom, that's exactly the point. The point is that while you and Dad were worried about what your friends at the country club would think, Miguel and I were building something you couldn't even see. We weren't just falling in love. We were becoming business partners. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, and I knew she was trying to figure out where this conversation was going. She'd always been good at reading people, at sensing when the power dynamic was shifting. It's how she'd managed to marry up into Dad's family money in the first place. The $50,000 you need, I continued, is that to cover your property taxes? How did you... She stopped herself. Elena, what's going on? I looked out my window again. The construction crew was taking their lunch break, sitting in the shade of the trees that lined Westbrook Heights' perfectly manicured streets. Miguel was probably with another crew across town, building someone else's dream while quietly funding our own. Mom, I want you to do something for me. I want you to go to your front window and look outside. Tell me what you see. Elena, I don't understand what this has to do with... Please, just look outside and tell me what you see. I heard her footsteps, the sound of curtains being pulled back. She was quiet for a long moment. I see the neighborhood, she said finally. The street, Mrs. Patterson's house across the way, the Johnson's place next door. Elena, what is this about? Look closer, I said. Look at the mailboxes. Look at the small signs in the yards. What do you see? Another pause. Longer this time. There are some small signs. Highland something. Highland Estates. Highland Estates Property Management, I said. That's my company, Mom. I own Mrs. Patterson's house. I own the Johnson's place. I own the Thompson house on the corner, the Martinez place down the street, and 16 other properties in your neighborhood, including yours. The silence stretched, between us like a canyon. That's impossible, she whispered. Your mortgage was sold to Westbrook Community Bank 2 years ago when Dad's firm started struggling. The bank sold it to me 6 months ago when you fell behind on payments. I've been your landlord for half a year, and you never knew. I could hear her breathing, sharp and shallow. Every time you drove past a Highland Estates sign, you were looking at something Miguel and I built together. Every time you complained about construction noise, you were complaining about crews working on our properties. Every time you told your friends about the changing neighborhood, you were talking about my investments appreciating in value. Elena, this can't be real. It's very real, Mom. The eviction notice you received? That came from my property management company. The $50,000 you need? That's what you owe in back rent and late fees on the house you thought you owned. I heard a sound that might have been crying, or laughing, or both. So when you called me this morning asking for help, I continued, you were asking your daughter, the one who married beneath her station, to bail you out of debt you accumulated while living in a house she owns, in a neighborhood she's been quietly buying up for years with money she earned alongside the man you told her wasn't good enough. The line went quiet except for the sound of her breathing. I need to call you back, she said finally. Mom? Yes? Miguel and I will be happy to work out a payment plan with you. We're not unreasonable landlords. But next time you want to judge someone's worth by their paycheck, you might want to make sure you know how much money they're actually making. She hung up without saying goodbye. I set the phone down and looked back out at the construction crew. Miguel had texted me earlier that they were ahead of schedule on the new project. Another building that would generate income for years to come. Another piece of the empire we were building together, one foundation at a time. The thing about being underestimated is that it gives you room to work in the shadows. While my parents were worried about appearances, Miguel and I were building real wealth. While they were trying to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford, we were quietly acquiring the assets that would fund our future. I opened my laptop and started typing an email to my property manager. 1247 Millbrook Avenue, payment plan. Options? It was time to be the landlord my parents never knew they had. Looking back, I should have seen the warning signs earlier. But when you grow up in a house where love comes with conditions, you learn to ignore the fine print until it's too late to negotiate. The Rodriguez family had a reputation in Westbrook Heights. We were the success story, the bootstrap narrative, that people pointed to when they wanted to prove the American dream was still alive. My father, David Rodriguez, had started with nothing. Son of migrant workers who'd managed to put himself through night school and build a consulting firm that specialized in helping small businesses navigate federal contracts. My mother, Patricia, came from old Portland money, the kind that whispers instead of shouts and measures worth in bloodlines rather than bank accounts. Their marriage had been scandalous in 1985. Patricia's family hadn't spoken to her for 3 years after she married that Hispanic man, as her grandmother had called him. But Dad's business took off, and money has a way of bleaching away inconvenient prejudices. By the time I was born in 1988, the Whitworth family had grudgingly accepted that their daughter had married up, even if it wasn't in the direction they'd expected. Growing up, our house was a museum of achievement. Dad's business awards lined the hallway. Mom's charity committee photos covered the piano. My report cards were magneted to the refrigerator like trophies, A's highlighted in yellow marker. Every success was celebrated, cataloged, displayed. Every failure was a learning opportunity that came with a lecture about not wasting our opportunities. Elena, Dad would say during our weekly dinner conversations about my grades, your mother and I didn't work this hard so you could be average. Average is what we left behind. The pressure was constant but loving, the way expensive perfume can be overwhelming but still beautiful. They wanted the best for me, which in their definition meant college, then graduate school, then a career. That came with business cards and corner offices. The military was never part of their plan. I remember the conversation when I first mentioned joining ROTC during my sophomore year at Portland State. I was majoring in business administration, maintaining a 3.8 GPA, and working weekends at Dad's office to learn the family business. but something about the structure and purpose of military service called to me in a way that quarterly profit reports never had. "Elena, mija," Dad had said, using the Spanish endearment he only pulled out when he was trying to be gentle about, delivering bad news. "You don't need the military. That's for kids who don't have other options. You have other options." Mom had been more direct. "The military is not appropriate for someone of your background, Elena. It's dangerous, and frankly, it's beneath your education level. You didn't go to Sacred Heart Academy and study business so you could play soldier. But I joined anyway, and to their credit, they adapted. When I commissioned as a second lieutenant, they threw a party and invited everyone they knew. Dad had business cards printed that read, 'David Rodriguez, father of Lieutenant Elena Rodriguez.' Mom bought a bumper sticker that said, 'Proud Army Mom,' and actually put it on her Mercedes, though she parked it in the back row at the country club. The problems started when I came back from my deployment to Afghanistan in 2014. I'd changed overseas, the way everyone does when they spend a year carrying the weight of other people's lives in your decisions. I'd learned to sleep through mortar fire and wake up instantly when someone needed help. I'd learned that leadership wasn't about being the smartest person in the room, but about making sure everyone in your squad made it home alive. I'd learned that the difference between rich and poor wasn't always about work ethic or intelligence. Sometimes it was just about which zip code you were born in, and whether your parents knew how to navigate systems that weren't designed for people like them. When I came home, I didn't fit into the box my parents had kept waiting for me. The first sign of trouble came at the welcome home party they threw at the country club. I was wearing my dress uniform, still carrying myself with the posture that 18 months of Army discipline had burned into my spine. The guests were mostly Dad's business associates and Mom's charity committee friends, people who wanted to thank me for my service with the same tone they used to compliment someone's landscaping. "Elena looks so different," I heard Mrs. Patterson whisper to Mom during the cocktail hour. "So serious. Military service changes people, doesn't it?" "She'll settle back into civilian life," Mom had replied. "It just takes time." But I wasn't settling back. I was restless, purposeful in a way that didn't fit their comfortable world of quarterly social obligations and investment portfolio reviews. The friends I'd grown up with seemed younger somehow, obsessed with concerns that felt manufactured compared to the real problems I'd seen overseas. That's when I started spending time at the VA center downtown, helping other veterans navigate their benefits and transition services. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly filling out forms and making phone calls, but it felt necessary in a way that nothing in my parents' world did. And that's where I met Miguel Santos. He was sitting in the lobby the first time I saw him, wearing work boots and jeans that were clean but worn, holding a folder of paperwork that looked like it had been read and reread dozens of times. His hair was military short, and he had the same alertness in his eyes that I recognized in my own mirror. The look of someone who'd learned to scan for exits and assess threats without thinking about it. "First time here?" I asked, sitting down beside him. He looked up and smiled, the kind of genuine expression that was rare in my parents' social circles. "Third time, actually. The paperwork keeps getting more complicated." He was trying to get approval for vocational training through the GI Bill. He wanted to start a construction company, but the VA kept asking for documentation he didn't know how to provide. His high school guidance counselor had never prepared him for federal bureaucracy, and his family didn't have the kind of connections that made phone calls return calls. I helped him sort through the forms, translating government language into plain English and showing him which boxes to check for the fastest processing. It took 3 hours, but by the end, he had a complete application and a timeline for approval. "I don't know how to thank you," he said as we walked toward the parking lot. "Buy me coffee sometime," I replied, surprised by my own boldness. He did. The next week, at a small cafe downtown that served espresso in mismatched mugs and had newspapers scattered across wooden tables. We talked for 4 hours. He told me about growing up in East Portland, about his father who'd worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat, about joining the army because college wasn't financially possible, but serving his country felt like the right thing to do. I told him about Westbrook Heights, about the pressure of being the success story, about coming home from deployment and feeling like I was living someone else's life. We talked about Afghanistan, about the friends we'd lost and the responsibility we felt to make their sacrifice mean something. That coffee date turned into dinner the following week. Dinner became weekend trips to look at construction sites where Miguel was working day labor while waiting for his business loan approval. I started learning about foundation work and electrical systems, about the difference between good craftsmanship and corner cutting, about the satisfaction of building something solid that would last. My parents noticed the change immediately. "You seem happier," Dad said during one of our Sunday dinners. "More settled. Are you seeing someone?" I told them about Miguel carefully, emphasizing his military service, his business plans, his work ethic. I thought those things would matter to them the way they mattered to me. "Construction," Mom repeated, as if she were testing how the word tasted. "That's interesting. Is it temporary while he figures out his real career?" "Construction is his real career, Mom. He's starting his own company." "Well," she said, sharing a look with Dad that I pretended not to notice, "I'm sure he's very nice. We'd love to meet him sometime." They met him 3 weeks later, when I brought him to Sunday dinner at their house. Miguel wore khakis and a button-down shirt, brought flowers for Mom, and asked thoughtful questions about Dad's business. He was respectful, articulate, and genuinely interested in their stories. But I could see them cataloging everything he wasn't. He didn't have a college degree. He didn't know which fork to use for the salad course. He didn't recognize the names they dropped, or understand the cultural references that were second nature in their social circle. After he left, they were kind, but concerned. "He seems like a very decent young man," Dad said carefully. "Hard-working, respectful. But Elena, you have to think long-term. What kind of life can he provide for you? What kind of future are you building together?" "The kind where we work as partners," I replied. "The kind where we build something together instead of inheriting it." "Inheritance isn't something to be ashamed of," Mom said. "Your father and I have worked hard to give you advantages. Why wouldn't you want to use them?" "I'm not ashamed of advantages, Mom, but I want to earn something for myself too." That conversation set the pattern for the next year. They were never openly hostile to Miguel, but they made it clear he was a temporary phase they were waiting for me to outgrow. When his business loan was approved and he hired his first employee, they asked when he was planning to expand into other areas. When he bought his first piece of heavy equipment, they wondered aloud about the risk involved in that kind of investment. Meanwhile, Miguel and I were falling in love and building something real together. He taught me to read blueprints and spot properties with good investment potential. I helped him with the business side: contracts, insurance, marketing, financial planning. We were becoming partners in every sense of the word. But my parents saw only what they expected to see: their educated daughter settling for less than she deserved. "Elena," Mom said during one of our monthly lunch dates, "you're 26 years old. Don't you want to start thinking about your future? About the kind of man you want to marry and raise children with?" "I am thinking about my future, Mom. Miguel is part of that future." "But is he really the kind of man you can build a life with? The kind of man who can provide stability, security? The kind of man you'd be proud to introduce to your colleagues and friends?" I should have defended him more forcefully. I should have told her that Miguel's integrity and work ethic meant more to me than anyone's opinion of his occupation. I should have explained that we were already building something together that felt more solid than anything in their carefully constructed world. Instead, I tried to bridge the gap. I kept hoping they would see what I saw in him, that time and familiarity would wear down their resistance. I thought love was enough to overcome prejudice, that good intentions could smooth over class differences. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. But I was right about Miguel, and eventually that would be enough. The explosion came disguised as a celebration. Miguel had proposed on a Thursday evening in March, not with a flashy public display or an expensive restaurant reservation, but in the quiet of my apartment after we'd spent the evening reviewing architectural plans for his company's biggest contract yet. A 2-story office building that would establish Santos Construction as a serious player in the commercial market. "Elena," he'd said, looking up from the blueprints scattered across my dining table, "I know we've talked about this before, but I want to make it official." He pulled out a ring box that was worn around the edges, the kind you could tell had been carried around for weeks while someone worked up the courage. Inside was his grandmother's engagement ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the light from my desk lamp like a star. "I can't promise you a big wedding or a honeymoon in Europe," he said, taking my hand. "But I can promise you a partnership, someone who will build something real with you, someone who will show up every day and do the work." I said yes before he finished the sentence. The ring felt perfect on my finger, not because it was expensive, but because it represented everything. We were building together: trust, commitment, a future based on shared values rather than shared bank accounts. I called my parents the next morning, expecting them to at least pretend to be happy for me. "Engaged," Mom repeated, her voice flat. "Well, that's certainly news." "Mom, I'm happy. We're happy. I thought you'd want to know." "Of course we want to know, mija," Dad said, though I could hear the strain in his voice. This is a big step. Have you thought about timing? Maybe a long engagement would be wise. Give you both time to make sure you're making the right decision." "We're sure, Dad. We've been together for 2 years. We know each other." 2 years isn't very long when you're talking about marriage," Mom interjected. "Elena, marriage is about more than feelings. It's about compatibility, about building a life together. Have you thought about the practical aspects? Where you'll live, how you'll support yourselves? What happens if you want children?" I should have hung up then. I should have recognized the interrogation disguised as concern. Instead, I tried to answer their questions, to prove that Miguel and I had thought things through. "We're looking at houses in the Selwood area. Miguel's business is growing, and I'm thinking about starting a consulting firm that helps veterans navigate federal contracting opportunities. We make a good team." "Selwood," Mom said, as if I'd announced we were moving to Mars. "Elena, that's quite a change from the lifestyle you grew up with." "It's a good neighborhood, Mom. We're not looking for a lifestyle. We're looking for a home." There was a long pause, the kind that feels like a trap closing. "Well," Dad said finally, "we'd like to meet with both of you. Talk about your plans, get to know Miguel better. Family dinner this Sunday. We'll make it special." I should have said no. I should have suggested neutral ground, a restaurant where they couldn't orchestrate the environment. But I wanted to believe they were trying, that Sunday dinner was an olive branch rather than an ambush. Miguel wore his best suit that Sunday, the navy one he'd bought for his grandmother's funeral and saved for the most important occasions. He'd gotten a haircut and spent 20 minutes in my bathroom mirror making sure his tie was straight. He was nervous in a way I'd rarely seen him, the kind of nervous that comes from knowing you're being evaluated and wanting desperately to pass the test. "They're going to love you," I told him as we walked up the brick pathway to my parents' front door. "Just be yourself." The house looked exactly the same as it had throughout my childhood, perfectly landscaped, tastefully decorated, a showcase of success that whispered rather than shouted. Mom answered the door wearing a dress that probably cost more than Miguel. Made in a week, her smile bright and sharp as crystal. "Miguel," she said, extending her hand like a queen expecting it to be kissed. "How lovely to see you again." Dad was waiting in the living room, standing behind the bar cart like he was hosting a business meeting rather than welcoming his future son-in-law. He'd set out the good glasses, the ones that came out for important guests and special occasions. "Congratulations are in order," he said, pouring scotch without asking what anyone wanted to drink. Marriage is a big step, a serious commitment. Thank you, sir, Miguel replied, accepting the glass even though I knew he preferred beer. Elena and I are excited about our future together. Tell us about this future, Mom said, settling into her chair with the kind of elegant precision she'd mastered over decades of social performances. Elena mentioned you're in construction. What followed was 20 minutes of the most polite interrogation I'd ever witnessed. They asked about his business plan, his insurance coverage, his long-term financial projections. They asked about his family, his education, his military service. Each question was delivered with a smile, but underneath was the clear message: prove to us that you're worthy of our daughter. Miguel answered every question with patience and dignity, explaining his vision for Santos Construction, his commitment to quality work, his plans for growth. He talked about the apartment complex he was hoping to bid on, the relationships he was building with suppliers, the employees he wanted to hire as the company expanded. I watched my parents' faces throughout the conversation, looking for signs of approval, for recognition of Miguel's intelligence and integrity. Instead, I saw polite interest masking growing disapproval. The breaking point came during dinner. We were eating Mom's famous beef tenderloin, the meal she prepared when she wanted to impress someone or remind them of her domestic capabilities. The conversation had moved to safer topics: the weather, current events, my work at the VA center. I was starting to think we might make it through the evening without incident. Then Dad asked the question that changed everything. Miguel, I'm curious about your long-term plans. Construction is certainly honest work, but have you considered expanding your horizons? Maybe getting a college degree, exploring other career options? Miguel set down his fork carefully, the way he did when he was choosing his words. I appreciate the question, Mr. Rodriguez. I've thought about college, but right now I'm focused on building my business. Construction isn't just a job for me. It's my profession. I take pride in creating things that last, in being part of building communities. But surely you understand that Elena has been raised with certain expectations, Mom interjected, her voice taking on the tone she used when she was about to deliver uncomfortable truths. She's educated, accomplished. She comes from a family with a certain standing in the community. Mom, I warned, but she continued as if I hadn't spoken. Marriage is about more than love, Miguel. It's about compatibility, about being able to provide the kind of life your spouse deserves. Elena is accustomed to certain standards. Miguel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Rodriguez, I may not have Elena's educational background, but I work hard and I provide for myself. I'm not asking Elena to lower her standards. I'm asking her to build something new with me. But what can you actually offer her? Dad asked, leaning forward with the intensity he brought to business negotiations. What kind of house can you afford? What kind of lifestyle? What happens when she wants to start a family? Can you support children on a construction worker's salary? I'm not just a construction worker, sir. I own my own company. We're profitable and growing. Elena and I have talked about our future, about what we want to build together. Dreams are wonderful, Mom said, with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile. But reality is something else entirely. Elena has opportunities, connections, advantages that shouldn't be wasted. She could marry someone who could truly provide for her, someone who could give her the life she deserves. That's when I understood what was happening. This wasn't a getting-to-know-you dinner. This was an intervention. Elena deserves to make her own choices, Miguel said, his voice still respectful but with an edge of steel I recognized from our time in the service. She's a grown woman, a veteran, someone who's proven she can handle responsibility and make good decisions. Of course she can make decisions, Dad replied. But sometimes people make emotional decisions that aren't in their best long-term interests. Sometimes people need perspective from those who love them and want what's best for them. And you don't think I want what's best for Elena? The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. I think you're a nice young man. Mom said finally. I think you mean well, but I also think you're asking Elena to settle for less than she could have. Less than she deserves. Miguel stood up slowly, placing his napkin on his plate with deliberate care. Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for dinner. I understand you want the best for Elena. So do I. The difference is, I think Elena is capable of deciding what the best means for her life. He turned to me. Elena, I'll wait for you in the car. After he left, the silence in the dining room felt like a vacuum. Well, Mom said, smoothing her napkin, that was unfortunate. Unfortunate? I repeated, finding my voice. You just interrogated my fiancé like he was applying for a job he wasn't qualified for. Elena, we're trying to protect you, Dad said. You're throwing away your advantages for a man who can't possibly give you the life you've been raised to expect. What life, Dad? The life where I marry someone you approve of and spend my weekends at the country club talking about nothing that matters? The life where I measure my worth by other people's opinions of my husband's paycheck? The life where you don't have to worry about money, Mom said sharply. The life where you can focus on your career and your family instead of wondering how you're going to pay the mortgage. The life where your children have the same advantages you had. Miguel and I will provide for our children. We'll teach them to work hard and treat people with respect. We'll show them that love and partnership matter more than impressing strangers. Elena, you're being naive, Dad said. Love doesn't pay bills. Love doesn't buy houses or fund college educations or provide security. You're 26 years old. You should understand this by now. I looked around the dining room, at the expensive furniture and carefully chosen artwork, at the life they'd built based on appearances and social positioning. For the first time, it looked empty to me. I do understand, I said, standing up. I understand that you think Miguel isn't good enough for me because he works with his hands instead of sitting behind a desk. I understand that you're more concerned about what your friends will think than about whether I'm happy. And I understand that you'd rather see me marry someone I don't love than someone you don't respect. That's not fair, Mom said. Isn't it? You haven't asked me once tonight if I'm happy. You haven't asked if Miguel treats me well or if we share the same values or if we make each other better people. You've only asked if he can afford to maintain the lifestyle you think I deserve. I picked up my purse and jacket. Elena, don't leave like this, Dad said. We can work this out. We can find a solution. The solution is for you to accept that I'm marrying Miguel with or without your approval. The solution is for you to realize that your daughter grew up and learned to make her own decisions. If you marry him, Mom said, her voice quiet and sharp, don't expect us to pretend we approve. Don't expect us to celebrate a decision we think is a mistake. I stopped at the dining room doorway and turned back to look at them. I'm not asking you to pretend anything, Mom. I'm asking you to trust that I know what I'm doing. I'm asking you to believe that the daughter you raised is smart enough to choose a partner who will make her happy. And if we can't do that? The question felt like a door slamming shut. Then I guess you'll miss out on seeing how happy we are together. I walked out of that house knowing that everything had changed, but I didn't yet understand how completely they were willing to cut me out of their lives. I thought parents eventually came around, that love would triumph over prejudice given enough time. I was wrong about that too. The dinner wasn't an isolated incident. It was the moment the mask finally slipped completely off a pattern that had been building for months. Looking back, I could trace the subtle sabotage that had started almost as soon as I'd gotten serious with Miguel. What I'd interpreted as parental concern had actually been a systematic campaign to undermine my relationship and push me back toward the life they'd planned for me. It started with the invitations. 3 weeks after I'd first brought Miguel to Sunday dinner, Mom began planning what she called family events that happened to fall on the weekends when Miguel and I had made plans together. Charity galas, dinner parties, important social functions where my presence was suddenly essential. Elena, the Whitmore Foundation Gala is next Saturday, she'd say during our weekly phone calls. Your father's being honored for his work with small business development. We really need you there to support him." When I explained that Miguel and I had already bought tickets to a benefit concert for local veterans, she'd sigh with disappointment. "Of course you can't cancel on Miguel." "I understand. It's just that these events are important for our family's reputation, and people notice when family members aren't there to show support." The guilt was expertly applied, just enough pressure to make me question my priorities without being overtly manipulative. I started declining plans with Miguel to attend family obligations, telling myself it was about balance, about maintaining relationships with everyone I cared about. Miguel never complained, but I could see the pattern affecting him. He'd make suggestions for weekend trips or evening plans, then quickly add, "Unless your family needs you for something." He was giving ground in small increments, making space for parents who had never made space for him. Then came the setup attempts. Mom had always been subtle about her matchmaking efforts, but after Miguel entered the picture, her introductions became more pointed. Suddenly, every family gathering included an eligible bachelor who just happened to be single, successful, and eager to meet the Rodriguez daughter. Then Dad asked the question that changed everything. "Miguel, I'm curious about your long-term plans. Construction is certainly honest work, but have you considered expanding your horizons? Maybe getting a college degree, exploring other career options?" Miguel set down his fork carefully, the way he did when he was choosing his words. "I appreciate the question, Mr. Rodriguez. I've thought about college, but right now I'm focused on building my business. Construction isn't just a job for me, it's my profession. I take pride in creating things that last, in being part of building communities." "But surely you understand that Elena has been raised with certain expectations," Mom interjected, her voice taking on the tone she used when she was about to deliver uncomfortable truths. "She's educated, accomplished. She comes from a family with a certain standing in the community." "Mom," I warned, but she continued as if I hadn't spoken. "Marriage is about more than love, Miguel. It's about compatibility, about being able to provide the kind of life your spouse deserves. Elena is accustomed to certain standards." Miguel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I may not have Elena's educational background, but I work hard and I provide for myself. I'm not asking Elena to lower her standards. I'm asking her to build something new with me." "But what can you actually offer her?" Dad asked, leaning forward with the intensity he brought to business negotiations. "What kind of house can you afford? What kind of lifestyle? What happens when she wants to start a family? Can you support children on a construction worker's salary?" "I'm not just a construction worker, sir. I own my own company. We're profitable and growing. Elena and I have talked about our future, about what we want to build together." "Dreams are wonderful," Mom said with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile. "But reality is something else entirely. Elena has opportunities, connections, advantages that shouldn't be wasted. She could marry someone who could truly provide for her, someone who could give her the life she deserves." That's when I understood what was happening. This wasn't a getting-to-know-you dinner. This was an intervention. "Elena deserves to make her own choices," Miguel said, his voice still respectful, but with an edge of steel I recognized from our time in the service. "She's a grown woman, a veteran, someone who's proven she can handle responsibility and make good decisions." "Of course she can make decisions," Dad replied. "But sometimes people make emotional decisions that aren't in their best long-term interests. Sometimes people need perspective from those who love them and want what's best for them." "And you don't think I want what's best for Elena?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the extinguished candle. "I think you're a nice young man," Mom said finally. "I think you mean well. But I also think you're asking Elena to settle for less than she could have, less than she deserves." Miguel stood up slowly, placing his napkin on his plate with deliberate care. Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for dinner. I understand you want the best for Elena. So do I. The difference is, I think Elena is capable of deciding what the best means for her life. He turned to me. Elena, I'll wait for you in the car. After he left, the silence in the dining room felt like a vacuum. Well, Mom said, smoothing her napkin, that was unfortunate. Unfortunate? I repeated, finding my voice. You just interrogated my fiancé like he was applying for a job he wasn't qualified for. Elena, we're trying to protect you, Dad said. You're throwing away your advantages for a man who can't possibly give you the life you've been raised to expect. What life, Dad? The life where I marry someone you approve of and spend my weekends at the country club talking about nothing that matters? The life where I measure my worth by other people's opinions of my husband's paycheck? The life where you don't have to worry about money, Mom said sharply. The life where you can focus on your career and your family instead of wondering how you're going to pay the mortgage. The life where your children have the same advantages you had. Miguel and I will provide for our children. We'll teach them to work hard and treat people with respect. We'll show them that love and partnership matter more than impressing strangers. Elena, you're being naive, Dad said. Love doesn't pay bills. Love doesn't buy houses or fund college educations or provide security. You're 26 years old. You should understand this by now. I looked around the dining room, at the expensive furniture and carefully chosen artwork, at the life they'd built based on appearances and social positioning. For the first time, it looked empty to me. I do understand, I said, standing up. I understand that you think Miguel isn't good enough for me because he works with his hands instead of sitting behind a desk. I understand that you're more concerned about what your friends will think than about whether I'm happy, and I understand that you'd rather see me marry someone I don't love than someone you don't respect. That's not fair, Mom said, isn't it? You haven't asked me once tonight if I'm happy. You haven't asked if Miguel treats me well or if we share the same values or if we make each other better people. You've only asked if he can afford to maintain the lifestyle you think I deserve. I picked up my purse and jacket. Elena, don't leave like this, Dad said. We can work this out. We can find a solution. The solution is for you to accept that I'm marrying Miguel with or without your approval. The solution is for you to realize that your daughter grew up and learned to make her own decisions. If you marry him, Mom said, her voice quiet and sharp, don't expect us to pretend we approve. Don't expect us to celebrate a decision we think is a mistake. I stopped at the dining room doorway and turned back to look at them. I'm not asking you to pretend anything, Mom. I'm asking you to trust that I know what I'm doing. I'm asking you to believe that the daughter you raised is smart enough to choose a partner who will make her happy. And if we can't do that? The question felt like a door slamming shut. Then I guess you'll miss out on seeing how happy we are together. I walked out of that house knowing that everything had changed, but I didn't yet understand how completely they were willing to cut me out of their lives. I thought parents eventually came around, that love would triumph over prejudice given enough time. I was wrong about that too. The dinner wasn't an isolated incident. It was the moment the mask finally slipped completely off a pattern that had been building for months. Looking back, I could trace the subtle sabotage that had started almost as soon as I'd gotten serious with Miguel. What I'd interpreted as parental concern had actually been a systematic campaign to undermine my relationship and push me back toward the life they'd planned for me. It started with the invitations. 3 weeks after I'd first brought Miguel to Sunday dinner, Mom began planning what she called family events that happened to fall on the weekends when Miguel and I had made plans together. Charity galas, dinner parties, important social functions where my presence was suddenly essential. Elena, the Whitmore Foundation Gala is next Saturday, she'd say during our weekly phone calls. Your father's being honored for his work with small business development. We really need you there to support him. When I explained that Miguel and I had already bought tickets to a benefit concert for local veterans, she'd sigh with disappointment. Of course you can't cancel on Miguel. I understand. It's just that these events are important for our family's reputation, and people notice when family members aren't there to show support. The guilt was expertly applied, just enough pressure to make me question my priorities without being overtly manipulative. I started declining plans with Miguel to attend family obligations, telling myself it was about balance, about maintaining relationships with everyone I cared about. Miguel never complained, but I could see the pattern affecting him. He'd make suggestions for weekend trips or evening plans, then quickly add, "Unless your family needs you for something." He was giving ground in small increments, making space for parents who had never made space for him. Then came the setup attempts. Mom had always been subtle about her matchmaking efforts, but after Miguel entered the picture, her introductions became more pointed. Suddenly, every family gathering included an eligible bachelor who just happened to be single, successful, and eager to meet the Rodriguez daughter. "Elena, you remember Thomas Chen from your father's office? He just finished his MBA at Wharton." "Thomas, Elena was telling me about her consulting work with veterans. Didn't you do some pro bono work with military families?" "Elena, I want you to meet Dr. Michael Stevens. He's the new cardiologist at Providence, and he served in the Navy. You two have so much in common." "Elena, this is James Morrison. His family owns Morrison Development." "James, Elena has such interesting ideas about urban planning and community development." Each introduction was accompanied by meaningful glances and carefully orchestrated conversations designed to highlight these men's accomplishments and eligibility. Mom would find reasons to leave me alone with them, create opportunities for extended conversations, then follow up later with casual questions about what I'd thought of so-and-so. The message was clear. Look what you could have instead. Miguel started noticing the pattern before I did. "Your mom really likes introducing you to people," he said one evening after a particularly obvious setup at Dad's birthday party. "She's just being social," I replied. But even as I said it, I knew it sounded weak. "Elena, that guy spent 40 minutes telling you about his vacation home in Aspen and his plans to run for city council. Your mom kept steering the conversation back to his accomplishments every time it drifted to other topics. I wanted to defend my parents, to insist that Miguel was reading too much into innocent social interactions. But the evidence was accumulating, in ways that were becoming harder to dismiss. The financial discussions started around the same time. Dad began having casual conversations about my future financial security, always when Miguel wasn't around. He'd bring up my trust fund, mention investment opportunities, discuss the importance of marrying within your means for long-term financial stability. "Elena, I've been reviewing your portfolio," he said during one of our monthly coffee meetings. "You're in a strong position for someone your age. The trust fund your grandmother left you, plus your military benefits and your current savings. You could afford a very comfortable lifestyle if you make smart decisions about your future." "I am making smart decisions, Dad." "I know you think you are, but marriage is a financial partnership, mija. When you marry someone, you're combining your financial futures. Have you thought about what that means practically?" He'd pull out spreadsheets, showing me projections of different scenarios. What my financial picture would look like married to someone with Miguel's income versus someone with a professional salary. The numbers were presented as objective data, but the conclusion was obvious. Marrying Miguel would limit my financial potential. "I'm not marrying Miguel for his money, Dad. I'm marrying him because I love him and we make a good team." "Love is important," he'd say. "But compatibility includes financial compatibility." "You've never had to worry about money, Elena. Do you really want to start now?" These conversations always ended with him expressing his love for me and his desire to see me happy. But the underlying message was consistent. Miguel couldn't provide the lifestyle I deserved, and choosing him meant choosing financial struggle. Social isolation was more subtle but equally systematic. Mom started planning activities that excluded Miguel by design. Girls' weekends with my female cousins and family friends. Shopping trips to find appropriate attire for family events. Spa days and wine tastings and cultural events that were presented as opportunities for female bonding, but felt more like opportunities to remove me from Miguel's influence. "We never get to spend time together anymore," she'd say. "I miss having my daughter to myself. Miguel understands that women need time with other women, doesn't he?" During these excursions, the conversation would inevitably turn to my relationship. My cousins, clearly prompted by Mom, would ask probing questions about my future plans, express concerns about whether I was settling, share stories about friends who'd married beneath their station and lived to regret it. "Elena, you know we all love you and want what's best for you," my cousin Sarah said during one particularly pointed conversation over brunch. "But don't you think you deserve someone who can match your ambition? Someone who can open doors for you instead of limiting your options?" "Miguel doesn't limit my options. He supports my goals." "But does he understand your goals? Does he get what you're trying to build with your career? Can he contribute to your professional network?" These questions were designed to plant seeds of doubt, to make me question whether Miguel truly understood my ambitions or could support my professional growth. The implication was always that love wasn't enough if it came without social and professional advantages. The military angle was perhaps the most insidious manipulation. Both my parents had initially been proud of my military service, despite their original reservations. But once Miguel entered the picture, they began reframing my Army experience in ways that supported their narrative about my relationship choices. Elena's time in the military was so important for her personal development. Mom would tell people at social gatherings. It taught her discipline and leadership skills that serve her well in civilian life. But of course, it also exposed her to a different social environment. Sometimes military friendships carry over into civilian life in ways that might not be optimal for long-term success. The suggestion was that my military service had somehow damaged my judgment about appropriate social connections, that the bonds formed in combat created loyalties that might conflict with civilian social advancement. Dad was more direct. "Elena, your military service was valuable, but you need to be careful not to let those relationships limit your civilian opportunities. Military friendships are based on shared hardship, but civilian success requires different kinds of partnerships." They were essentially arguing that my connection with Miguel, based on shared military experience and values, was a liability rather than an asset, something I needed to outgrow rather than build upon. The wedding planning sabotage was the most obvious manifestation of their disapproval. When Miguel and I announced our engagement date, a simple ceremony planned for the following spring, Mom immediately began suggesting complications. The venue wasn't appropriate for someone of my background. The guest list needed to be reconsidered to include important family friends. The reception should be more elaborate to properly represent what the Rodriguez family stands for. Every suggestion came with financial strings attached. They offered to pay for a larger, more expensive wedding, but only if we agreed to their vision of what the event should look like. When we declined and insisted on our original plans, they expressed hurt that we didn't want their help or input. "Elena, this wedding reflects on our entire family," Mom said during one particularly tense planning conversation. "People will judge, not just you and Miguel, but all of us. Don't you want your wedding to be something we can all be proud of?" The implication was that our simple, modest wedding would embarrass them in front of their social circle, that our choices reflected poorly on the family's status and reputation. But the most damaging pattern was the steady erosion of their confidence. In my judgment, every decision Miguel and I made together was subtly questioned. Our choice of neighborhood, our financial planning, our career decisions, our lifestyle choices, everything was subject to gentle criticism disguised as parental concern. "Are you sure about buying a house in that area, Elena? The property values aren't very stable there. Elena, I'm not sure Miguel's business plan is as solid as you think. Construction is such a volatile industry. Elena, are you certain about leaving your VA position to start consulting? It seems like a big risk, especially when you're planning a wedding. Each question was presented as loving concern, but the cumulative effect was to make me doubt my own decision-making abilities. If my parents, who loved me and wanted what was best for me, had concerns about all these choices, maybe I wasn't thinking clearly. Maybe love was clouding my judgment. The pattern was sophisticated and relentless. Every conversation, every family gathering, every interaction was designed to slowly separate me from Miguel and guide me back toward the life they'd envisioned for me. They weren't attacking him directly. That would have been too obvious and might have backfired. Instead, they were undermining the foundation of our relationship by making me question whether I was making good choices, whether I deserved better, whether I was limiting myself by choosing love over social advancement. What made it particularly insidious was that it came wrapped in genuine love and concern. They did want what they thought was best for me. They were trying to protect me from what they saw as a mistake that would limit my potential and happiness. Their manipulations came from a place of caring, which made them harder to recognize, and even harder to resist. But caring doesn't excuse control. Love doesn't justify manipulation, and protection doesn't require isolation from the people who make you happy. By the time I fully recognized the pattern, it had been going on for months, slowly but systematically attempting to dismantle the relationship that had become the most important thing in my life. The family dinner hadn't been the beginning of their campaign against Miguel. It had been the moment they decided subtle manipulation wasn't working, and it was time for direct confrontation. The final break came 3 weeks before our wedding, and it wasn't even about Miguel directly. It was about money, control, and a hospital bed that showed me exactly how conditional my parents' love had always been. Miguel had been working on a commercial renovation project downtown, a 3-story office building that would establish Santos Construction as a major player in the Portland market. It was the kind of contract that could change everything for his business, the foundation for the expansion we'd been planning together. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in February. A piece of scaffolding gave way during a routine inspection, and Miguel fell 20 feet onto concrete. By the time I got to the hospital, he was unconscious, hooked to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision. The doctors used words like serious head injury and uncertain prognosis and we'll know more in the next 48 hours. I called my parents from the hospital corridor, my hands shaking as I dialed their number. Despite everything that had happened between us, they were still my parents. I still needed them in that moment of terror when I thought I might lose the man I was supposed to marry in 3 weeks. "Mom," I said when she answered, my voice breaking. "Miguel's been in an accident. He's in the ICU at Portland General. I don't know if he's going to be okay." There was a pause that lasted too long. "Oh my," she said finally. "Elena, I'm so sorry. That must be very frightening for you. Can you come? I know things have been difficult between us, but I really need my family right now." Another pause. "Elena, your father has a very important meeting this afternoon with potential investors, and I have the charity committee dinner tonight. We can't just drop everything." I stared at the hospital wall, painted that particular shade of green that's supposed to be calming but just looks sick under fluorescent lights. "Mom, the man I'm supposed to marry in 3 weeks might not wake up. I'm asking you to come to the hospital." "Elena, you're being dramatic. I'm sure Miguel will be fine. These things usually look worse than they are. Why don't you call us tomorrow? When you have more information?" That's when I understood. My parents weren't coming because they saw Miguel's accident as an opportunity, not a tragedy. They were hoping this would be the crisis that brought me to my senses, that made me realize how fragile my future with him really was. "You're not coming," I said. It wasn't a question. "Elena, we'll certainly visit when it's appropriate. But right now, you need to focus on practical matters. Has anyone contacted his family? What about his business? Who's handling his insurance? Claims? She was talking about Miguel like he was a problem to be managed rather than a person fighting for his life. Even in crisis, even when I was begging for support, their response was calculated, strategic, designed to reinforce their message that this relationship was more trouble than it was worth. Never mind, I said. I'll handle it myself. Elena, we're here if you need us, but you need to think practically about your situation. If Miguel can't work, if there are medical bills, if his business fails, these are serious considerations for your future. I hung up without saying goodbye. Miguel's family arrived within 2 hours. His parents, Maria and Carlos, drove up from Medford. His sister Rosa flew in from San Francisco. His army buddy Derek took leave from his job to be there. Within 6 hours, the ICU waiting room was full of people who loved Miguel, people who were praying for him, people who brought food and coffee and refused to leave until we knew he was going to be okay. My parents never came. For 3 days, I lived in that hospital. I slept in uncomfortable chairs, ate vending machine food, and held Miguel's hand while machines monitored his vital signs. His family surrounded me with the kind of support I'd never experienced from my own parents. Unconditional, immediate, without calculation or agenda. Maria brought me clothes from my apartment. Carlos dealt with the insurance companies and made sure Miguel's crew knew what was happening with the job site. Rosa sat with me during the longest night when the doctors warned us that the next few hours were critical. He's going to be okay, she told me, holding my hand in the dark waiting room. Miguel's the strongest person I know. He survived Afghanistan. He's going to survive this. On Thursday evening, Miguel opened his eyes. The first word he said was my name. By Friday, the doctors were cautiously optimistic. There would be a long recovery, months of physical therapy, but no permanent brain damage. Miguel would be okay. His business could survive. Our wedding could happen as planned. That's when my parents finally called. Elena, we heard the good news, Mom said, her voice bright with false cheer. We're so relieved that Miguel is going to recover. How did you hear? Mrs. Patterson mentioned it. She saw the story in the business section about the construction accident. We're so glad everything worked out. The business section. They'd learned about Miguel's condition from a newspaper article about workplace safety, not from their daughter, who'd been living through the crisis for 5 days. Where were you? I asked. Elena, we explained our situation. We had commitments we couldn't break. But we're here now. We'd like to visit Miguel. Bring him some flowers. Don't. Elena, we're trying to do the right thing here. We want to support you through this difficult time. You had the chance to support me through this difficult time. You chose not to come when I needed you. You chose your social obligations over your daughter's crisis. You don't get to show up now that everything's resolved and pretend you were here when it mattered. Elena, you're being unfair. We couldn't have known how serious it was. I told you he might not wake up. I told you I needed my family. You told me you had a dinner meeting. Elena, we're your parents. We love you. We're trying to do what's best for you, even when you can't see it. That phrase, what's best for you, had become their justification for every manipulation, every attempt to control my life, every moment they'd chosen their vision of my future over my actual happiness. You want to know what's best for me? I said, my voice steady despite the anger burning in my chest. What's best for me is a partner who shows up when I need him. What's best for me is a family that supports me during a crisis instead of using it as leverage. What's best for me is people who love me enough to put my needs ahead of their social calendar. Elena, we do love you. Everything we've done has been because we love you. No. Everything you've done has been because you love the idea of me that exists in your imagination. The version of me that makes choices you approve of, that marries someone you can brag about at the country club, that lives the life you planned instead of the life I chose. Elena, please don't say things you'll regret. I don't regret anything, Mom. I regret spending months trying to bridge a gap you had no intention of crossing. I regret believing that your love was unconditional when it clearly comes with terms and conditions I'll never be able to meet. There was a long silence. Elena, if you marry him, don't expect us to be there to pick up the pieces when it falls apart. I'm not expecting you to be there for anything anymore, Mom. You've made it very clear that your support comes with strings attached, and I'm done trying to meet your conditions. Elena, you're making a mistake. A big one. And when you realize that, when you need help dealing with the consequences of this choice, don't expect us to welcome you back with open arms. Are you cutting me off? We're not cutting you off. We're protecting ourselves from watching you destroy your life. When you're ready to make better decisions, we'll be here. But we won't enable your mistakes or pretend to support choices we think are wrong. The line went quiet, except for the sound of her breathing. Elena, we love you. But love sometimes means letting people learn from their own mistakes. And sometimes, love means showing up when the people you care about are in crisis, regardless of whether you approve of their choices. Sometimes love means putting someone else's needs ahead of your own agenda. Elena, Mom, I'm getting married in 2 weeks. Miguel and I would like you and Dad to be there, but we're getting married whether you come or not. If you choose not to come, that's your decision. But don't pretend it's about love or protection or what's best for me. It's about control, and I'm done being controlled. She hung up without saying goodbye. The wedding invitation had been sitting on their kitchen counter for 6 weeks. They'd never RSVP'd, never confirmed whether they were coming, never offered to help with any of the preparations. I'd kept hoping they would come around, that parental love would eventually overcome their disapproval. 2 days before the wedding, I got their final answer. It came in the form of a formal letter, typed on Dad's business letterhead, and mailed to my apartment like a business communication, rather than a family message. Dear Elena, it began. After much consideration, your mother and I have decided that we cannot in good conscience attend your wedding. We believe you are making a serious mistake that will have long-term consequences for your happiness and security. While we love you and want what's best for you, we cannot pretend to support a decision we fundamentally disagree with. We hope that someday you will understand that our absence comes from a place of love, not rejection. We will always be here when you're ready to reconsider your choices. Love, Mom and Dad. I read the letter 3 times, sitting on my couch in the apartment Miguel and I shared, wearing the wedding dress I'd bought without my mother's input or approval. The dress was simple, elegant, chosen because Miguel had told me I looked beautiful in anything, but especially in white. Miguel found me there an hour later, still holding the letter, still wearing the dress. They're not coming, I told him. He sat down beside me and took the letter, reading it silently. When he finished, he folded it carefully and set it aside. I'm sorry, he said. Are you? Really? He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I'm sorry that they're hurting you, he said finally. I'm sorry that their love comes with conditions you can't meet. I'm sorry that they're choosing their pride over their daughter's happiness. But I'm not sorry that they won't be there to make you feel guilty for choosing me. I'm not sorry that we won't have to worry about their disapproval overshadowing our day. And I'm not sorry that you're finally free to live your life without constantly trying to earn their approval. He was right. The letter hurt, but it was also liberating. For the first time since I'd gotten engaged, I could plan my wedding, my marriage, my future without considering their opinions or trying to bridge an unbridgeable gap. Elena, Miguel said, taking my hand, we're going to have a beautiful wedding surrounded by people who love us and want us to be happy. We're going to build a life together based on what we want, not what anyone else thinks we should want. And someday, maybe your parents will realize what they gave up. But even if they don't, we're going to be okay. He was right about that too. We were going to be more than okay. We were going to be happy, successful, and completely independent of people who thought love should come with terms and conditions. The wedding was perfect without them. The discoveries started small, the way secrets always unravel. One loose thread that, when pulled, reveals an entire fabric of deception. Miguel and I had been married for 8 months when I got the call from my college roommate, Jessica. She was working as a paralegal at a law firm downtown, and she'd stumbled across something she thought I should know about. "Elena, I need to see you," she said, her voice tight with the kind of urgency that makes your stomach drop. "Can you meet me for coffee this afternoon? There's something I have to show you." We met at a small cafe in the Pearl District, far from both our neighborhoods and my parents' usual haunts. Jessica arrived with a manila folder and the expression of someone about to deliver bad news. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you about this," she began, sliding the folder across the table. "But I figured you had a right to know." Inside were photocopies of legal documents, property transfers, mortgage applications, financial statements. My name was on several of them, signatures that looked like mine but felt wrong somehow, like seeing your handwriting in a dream. "Jessica, what is this?" "Your parents hired our firm to handle some property transactions about 2 years ago. I was organizing old files when I noticed your name on these documents. Elena, did you know you were listed as a co-signer on your parents' house refinancing?" I stared at the papers, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The signature looked like mine, but I had no memory of signing any refinancing documents. The date was from when Miguel and I had first gotten serious, when my parents were still trying to convince me he was wrong for me. "I never signed these," I said. Jessica's face confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. "I was afraid you'd say that. Elena, there are 3 other documents with your signature. A second mortgage, a line of credit, and something called a family trust modification." "A family trust modification?" "It changes the beneficiary structure of your grandfather's trust, the one that was supposed to provide your education funding and eventually transfer to you. According to these documents, you've waived your rights to future distributions in favor of immediate family financial stability." The words felt like physical blows. I'd never signed anything waiving my rights to my grandfather's trust. I'd never even been told there were decisions to be made about it. "Jessica, these signatures? They're not mine." That's what I was afraid of. "Elena, I think your parents might have forged your signature on these documents. And if that's true, they've been using your credit and your legal identity to secure loans and modify trusts without your knowledge or consent." I drove home in a daze, the folder of documents sitting beside me like evidence of a crime I was only beginning to understand. When I told Miguel what Jessica had discovered, his reaction was immediate and unambiguous. "Elena, that's fraud. Identity theft. We need to call the police." "They're my parents, Miguel. I can't just—" "Yes, you can. This isn't about family loyalty. This is about criminal activity. They used your identity to secure loans you didn't know about, modified legal documents, without your consent, and potentially put you on the hook for debts you didn't agree to take on." But I wasn't ready to involve law enforcement. Not yet. First, I needed to understand the full scope of what they'd done. The next morning, I called my bank and requested copies of all accounts that had ever been associated with my Social Security number. What I discovered made me physically sick. There were accounts I'd never opened, credit cards I'd never applied for, a business loan for something called Rodriguez Family Enterprises that listed me as a co-signer despite the fact that I'd never heard of the company. My credit report showed debts I'd never incurred and payment histories for accounts I'd never known existed. The pattern was sophisticated and systematic. They'd been using my identity for financial transactions for at least 3 years, always in small enough amounts to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts, always with documentation that looked legitimate on the surface. But the trust modification was the most devastating discovery. My grandfather had established an education trust specifically for me when I was 10 years old. It was designed to fund my college education and then transfer to me completely when I turned 30. The trust had been worth nearly $200,000 when Grandpa died, money he'd saved specifically to ensure I would have educational opportunities and financial security. According to the forged documents Jessica had found, I had voluntarily waived my rights to that trust in favor of allowing my parents to use the funds for family financial stabilization. The entire $200,000 had been withdrawn over the past 2 years and used to cover my parents' debts and maintain their lifestyle. The money my grandfather had saved for my future had been stolen and spent on maintaining the very lifestyle my parents had used to judge Miguel as inadequate. I confronted them on a Saturday afternoon, walking into their house without calling first, carrying copies of every document Jessica had found and every fraudulent account I'd discovered. "We need to talk," I said, spreading the papers across their dining room table. Mom looked at the documents and went pale. Dad tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the panic in his eyes. "Elena, let us explain." "Explain what, Dad?" "Explain how you forged my signature on loan documents? Explain how you opened credit accounts in my name without my knowledge? Explain how you stole my grandfather's trust fund?" "Elena, we were protecting the family," Mom said, her voice shaking. "When your father's business started struggling, we had to make some difficult decisions. We thought you would understand." "Understand what?" "Understand that you committed fraud using my identity? Understand that you stole money my grandfather saved for my education?" "We borrowed against your future inheritance," Dad said, as if changing. The terminology somehow made it legal. "We always planned to pay it back." "You stole it, Dad, and you've been doing it for years. Every time you criticized Miguel for not being able to provide for me, every time you questioned whether he could support a family, every time you worried about my financial security, you were spending money that was rightfully mine." "Elena, we were trying to preserve our family's stability so we could continue to support you." "Support me? You've destroyed my credit, put me on the hook for debts I didn't know about, and stolen my inheritance to fund a lifestyle you couldn't afford. How is that supporting me?" The conversation that followed revealed the full extent of their financial manipulation and deception. They'd been struggling financially for nearly 4 years, ever since Dad's consulting business had lost several major contracts. Rather than downsize their lifestyle or admit their difficulties, they'd decided to use my identity and inheritance to maintain their standard of living. The timing wasn't coincidental. They'd started the fraud around the same time I'd gotten serious with Miguel, when it became clear that I wasn't going to follow their plan for my life. If I wasn't going to marry someone who could support their vision of family success, they would use my resources to support it themselves. "We thought you'd never need to know," Mom said, tears streaming down her face. "We thought once you came to your senses about Miguel, once you made better choices, we could transfer everything back and no one would be hurt. So this was punishment for marrying Miguel. You stole my inheritance because I didn't marry someone you approved of?" "We were protecting family assets from bad decisions," Dad said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when he was trying to end arguments through intimidation. "Elena, you chose to marry someone who couldn't provide for you properly. We had to ensure there were family resources available for your future security. By stealing from me? By committing fraud? By destroying my credit? By making sure the family had resources to help you when this marriage fails and you need us again." The logic was breathtaking in its selfishness. They'd stolen from me to ensure they could rescue me from consequences of choices they disapproved of. They'd committed crimes against me because they were so certain my marriage would fail that they wanted to position themselves as my saviors when it happened. "Elena," Mom said, reaching for my hand, "we can fix this. We can transfer everything back, restore your credit, make this right. You just have to understand that we did this out of love." "Love doesn't steal, Mom. Love doesn't commit fraud. Love doesn't destroy someone's financial future to fund your own lifestyle. I gathered the documents and stood up to leave. Elena, where are you going? We need to work this out as a family. I'm going to talk to a lawyer. Then I'm going to talk to the police. Then I'm going to talk to the IRS, because I'm betting there are tax implications to what you've done that you haven't thought through. Elena, you can't be serious. We're your parents. You're criminals who happen to share my DNA. The fact that you're my parents makes this worse, not better. But the discoveries didn't stop there. Over the next 2 weeks, as I worked with Jessica's law firm to untangle the full scope of the fraud, we uncovered layers of deception that went back even further than I'd initially realized. They'd been intercepting mail addressed to me for years, redirecting financial statements and legal documents to ensure I never saw evidence of accounts opened in my name. They'd used my VA benefits information to apply for loans targeted at veterans, using my military service as collateral for their debts. Most shocking of all, they'd been planning to use my marriage to Miguel as an opportunity for even more extensive fraud. There were draft documents that would have made Miguel financially responsible for debts he'd never agreed to take on, using community property laws to extend their financial manipulation to my husband. They hadn't just been trying to break up my marriage, they'd been planning to use it as a vehicle for even more extensive financial exploitation. The investigation revealed that their financial situation was far worse than I'd realized. They were facing foreclosure on the house, bankruptcy from the debts they'd accumulated, and potential criminal charges for the fraud they'd committed using my identity. They'd been living a lie for years, maintaining a lifestyle they couldn't afford by stealing from their daughter's future. Every criticism of Miguel's financial prospects, every concern about my financial security, every lecture about making responsible choices had been delivered by people who were systematically destroying my financial stability to prop up their own illusions. The house they'd been so proud of, the lifestyle they'd used to judge Miguel as inadequate, the social status they'd prioritized over their daughter's happiness, all of it had been funded with money stolen from me. When Miguel and I sat down with the lawyers to understand our options, the scope of our potential legal remedies was staggering. We could pursue criminal charges, civil lawsuits, restitution claims, and credit restoration processes that would take years to complete. But what struck me most wasn't the legal complexity or the potential financial recovery. It was the realization that my parents had never seen me as a separate person with my own rights and interests. I had always been, in their minds, an extension of their own ambitions and security. My identity, my credit, my inheritance, my future. All of it was just resources they felt entitled to use for their own purposes. They'd stolen my grandfather's money not just to maintain their lifestyle, but to maintain their power over my choices. As long as they controlled resources I might need, they could continue to influence my decisions and maintain leverage over my independence. But they'd miscalculated. By the time they'd committed fraud against me, Miguel and I were already building our own financial security. We didn't need their stolen money or their manipulative support. We were succeeding without them, which made their crimes not just morally reprehensible, but strategically pointless. The irony was perfect. They'd stolen from me to protect themselves from the consequences of my independence, but their theft had only accelerated that independence by forcing me to build financial systems that excluded them completely. They'd wanted to control my future by controlling my resources. Instead, they'd guaranteed that they would have no role in my future at all. The decision to fight back wasn't born from anger. It was born from clarity. Miguel and I spent that first weekend after the discovery sitting at our kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents, bank statements, and a yellow legal pad where we'd written down every option the lawyers had presented. Criminal charges, civil suits, bankruptcy proceedings, credit restoration. The legal pathways stretched out like a maze of possibilities, each with its own timeline and consequences. "What do you want to do?" Miguel asked, his hand covering mine, across the papers. I looked at the evidence of my parents' betrayal, at the systematic theft that had funded their judgment of my choices. and I realized something had shifted inside me. The daughter who had spent months trying to bridge an unbridgeable gap with her parents was gone. In her place was a woman who understood that some relationships can't be salvaged. They can only be survived. I want to build something they can. Never touch, I said. That Monday, I walked into the offices of Martinez and Associates, the law firm Jessica had recommended, and hired them to pursue full legal remediation. But more importantly, I hired them to help me understand exactly how to protect myself from future manipulation. Sarah Martinez, the senior partner, laid out a comprehensive strategy that went beyond just recovering what had been stolen. Elena, we're not just going to get your money back. We're going to make sure they can never use your identity again. And we're going to create legal barriers that protect any future assets you build. The first step was documentation. We spent weeks building an ironclad case, compiling every forged signature, every fraudulent account, every stolen dollar. But I wasn't just collecting evidence for court. I was learning exactly how financial manipulation works, how to spot it, and how to prevent it. The second step was separation. We'd legally severed every financial connection between me and my parents, closed every joint account, removed my name from every shared obligation, and established independent credit monitoring that would alert me to any future attempts to use my identity. The third step was building. While the lawyers pursued criminal charges and civil recovery, Miguel and I accelerated our own wealth-building strategy. We took the business model that had been working for Santos Construction and expanded it strategically. Instead of just taking on construction jobs, we started identifying undervalued properties, renovating them through Miguel's company, and converting them into rental income. Elena, Miguel said one evening as we reviewed our first quarterly investment report, we're not just building a business anymore. We're building an empire. He was right. Within 6 months of discovering my parents' fraud, we'd purchased our first investment property, a small duplex in southeast Portland that generated enough rental income to fund our next purchase. Within a year, we owned 4 properties. Within 18 months, we'd established Highland Estates Property Management as a legitimate real estate investment company. But the most empowering part wasn't the money. It was the knowledge. Every property purchase taught me something new about real estate law, property valuation, market analysis, and investment strategy. Every renovation project taught me about construction costs, contractor management, and property improvement. Every rental agreement taught me about tenant relations, property maintenance, and income optimization. I wasn't just building wealth. I was building expertise that my parents could never have taught me because they'd never actually built anything themselves. Their entire lifestyle had been maintained through borrowing, spending other people's money, and manipulating systems they didn't understand well enough to legally navigate. Miguel and I were different. We understood every aspect of our business because we'd built it from nothing, learned every lesson the hard way, and made every decision together based on actual knowledge rather than inherited assumptions. The legal case against my parents moved through the system with predictable efficiency. They hired expensive lawyers and tried to characterize the fraud as family financial planning and intergenerational wealth management. But forged signatures are forged signatures, and stolen money is stolen money, regardless of how eloquently you try to reframe the theft. The criminal charges resulted in probation and financial restitution. The civil suit resulted in a judgment that gave us legal claims against their assets. But the most satisfying result was the credit restoration that removed every fraudulent account from my financial record and established legal protections against future identity theft. By the time the legal proceedings concluded, Miguel and I had built something that made my parents' stolen trust fund look like pocket change. Our property portfolio was generating monthly income that exceeded what they'd taken from my grandfather's savings. Our business was profitable, growing, and completely independent of anyone else's financial support or approval. But we weren't finished building. The real empowerment came when we realized we could use our success to help other people avoid the manipulation we'd experienced. I started offering financial literacy workshops for veterans, teaching them how to protect their identities, build wealth, and avoid the kind of family financial abuse that had been used against me. Miguel began mentoring young veterans who wanted to start their own businesses, sharing the practical knowledge he'd gained building Santos Construction from nothing. We created scholarship programs for first-generation college students who needed financial support without family strings attached. "Elena," Miguel said one evening as we reviewed applications for our first scholarship recipients, "your parents tried to control your future by controlling your money. We're giving other people the tools to control their own futures." The scholarship program grew into a nonprofit organization. The nonprofit organization grew into a network of veteran-owned businesses that supported each other through contracts, referrals, and shared resources. The network grew into a community of people who understood that real security comes from building something yourself, not from maintaining control over other people. 3 years after discovering my parents' fraud, Miguel and I received an invitation to speak at a veterans business conference about building wealth through real estate investment. The invitation came with a surprising piece of information. We were being recognized as one of the fastest-growing veteran-owned business partnerships in the Pacific Northwest. Elena Santos, the conference program read, co-founder of Highland Estates Property Management and Santos Construction Partnership, will speak about leveraging military leadership skills for civilian entrepreneurship. Santos. Somewhere along the way, I'd started using Miguel's name professionally, not because I'd abandoned my own identity, but because I'd chosen to build something new with someone who actually valued partnership over control. The night before the conference, Miguel and I walked through our latest property acquisition, a 12-unit apartment complex in Northeast Portland that we'd purchased, renovated, and converted into affordable housing for working families. "Miguel," I said, looking at the building we'd transformed from an abandoned eyesore into clean, safe homes for a dozen families, "do you ever think about what your life would look like if we'd listened to my parents?" He was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes," he said finally. "I think you might have married someone they approved of, someone who could give you the lifestyle they thought you deserved. You might have been comfortable, secure, socially acceptable. But you wouldn't have been you, the woman who builds scholarship programs and teaches financial literacy workshops and turns abandoned buildings into homes for families. That woman exists because you chose partnership over security, because you chose building something new over maintaining something old." He was right. The person I'd become through building Highland Estates, through surviving my parents' betrayal, through creating something meaningful with Miguel, that person couldn't have existed within the constraints my parents had tried to impose on my life. They'd wanted me to inherit their version of success. Instead, I'd built my own definition of wealth, and it included things they'd never understood: genuine partnership, meaningful work, financial independence, and the satisfaction of creating opportunities for other people to build their own security. By the time we received that first call from my parents asking for financial help, Highland Estates owned 17 properties in Portland and was expanding into other markets. We employed 12 people, generated 6 figures in annual income, and had built the kind of financial stability that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval or support. We'd built something they couldn't touch, something they couldn't manipulate, and something they definitely couldn't afford. Which brings us back to that phone call 3 months ago, when my mother's shaky voice asked for $50,000 to help with their temporary financial difficulties. Sitting in my home office, looking out at the construction crew working on our newest property acquisition, I realized the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for had finally arrived. My parents needed me, but not the way parents are supposed to need their children. They needed me the way they'd always seen me, as a resource to be used, a problem to be solved, a tool to maintain their lifestyle. "Mom," I said, pulling up the Highland Estates property management dashboard on my computer. Before we talk about money, I want you to look outside your window again. Look at those Highland Estates signs in your neighborhood. I heard her footsteps, the sound of curtains being pulled back. I'm looking, she said impatiently. Elena, what does this have to do with helping us through a difficult time? Count them, Mom. Count how many Highland Estates signs you can see from your front window. A pause. I see maybe 4 or 5. Elena, I don't understand what this has to do with. I own all of those houses, Mom. The Patterson house, the Johnson place, the Martinez property, the Thompson house on the corner. I own them all. And I own yours too. The silence stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. That's impossible, she whispered finally. Your mortgage was sold to Westbrook Community Bank 2 years ago when Dad's consulting business started failing. The bank sold it to me 6 months ago when you fell behind on payments. I've been your landlord since October and you never knew it. I heard what might have been crying or laughing or both. Elena, this can't be real. It's very real, Mom. The eviction notice you received last week? That came from my property management company. The $50,000 you need? That's what you owe in back rent and late fees on a house you thought you owned, in a neighborhood I've been quietly purchasing for the past 4 years. The revelation hit exactly the way I'd imagined it would, like a demolition that clears the ground for something entirely new to be built. But how? She asked, her voice small and confused. How is this possible? Remember Miguel, Mom? The construction worker you said could never provide for me? The man you said I was settling for? He taught me how to read property values, how to spot undervalued real estate, how to renovate and manage rental properties. While you and Dad were worried about my financial security, Miguel and I were building actual financial security. Elena, we never meant. You meant exactly what you said, Mom. You said Miguel couldn't provide the lifestyle I deserved. You said I was throwing away my advantages for someone who worked with his hands. You said I was making a mistake that would limit my opportunities. I pulled up our latest financial statements, numbers that would have seemed impossible when my parents were stealing my grandfather's trust fund to maintain their illusions. Highland Estates Property Management is now worth $2.3 million, Mom. We employ 15 people. We provide housing for over 60 families. Miguel's construction company has contracts booked through next year. The man you said could never support me has helped me build more wealth in 5 years than Dad accumulated in his entire career. Elena, we were trying to protect you. You were trying to control me. And when I wouldn't let you control my choices, you stole from me. You committed fraud using my identity, stole my inheritance, and destroyed my credit to fund the very lifestyle you used to judge my husband as inadequate. The silence on the other end told me she was beginning to understand the full scope of the situation. Every time you criticized Miguel's prospects, you were spending money that rightfully belonged to me. Every time you worried about my financial future, you were actively destroying it to prop up your own. Every time you suggested I could do better, you were living off resources you'd stolen from my grandfather's trust fund. We always planned to pay it back, she said weakly. You planned to use it as leverage to control my decisions. As long as you had resources I might need, you could continue to influence my choices and make me dependent on your approval. I stood up and walked to the window, watching Miguel's crew frame the foundation of our newest project, a 20-unit apartment complex that would generate enough income to fund our next expansion. But you miscalculated, Mom. By the time you stole from me, Miguel and I were already building something you couldn't touch. We didn't need your money or your approval. We were succeeding without you, which made your theft not just criminal, but pointless. Elena, we can work this out. We can make this right. We're still your family. No, Mom. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't commit fraud against their own children. Family doesn't abandon their daughter during a medical crisis because they have dinner plans. I pulled up the payment plan options my property manager had prepared. Here's what's going to happen. Highland Estates will work out a reasonable payment plan for your back rent. We're not unreasonable landlords. We'll give you terms you can actually meet. But this is a business relationship now, not a family relationship. Elena, please don't do this. We love you. We made mistakes, but we love you. Love doesn't steal. Mom. Love doesn't manipulate. Love doesn't abandon people during crises. Love shows up when people need it, regardless of whether you approve of their choices. I heard her crying now, the sound of someone finally understanding that actions have consequences that can't be undone with explanations or apologies. The $50,000 you asked for? I could write that check right now without even thinking about it. Miguel and I made more than that last month just from our rental income. But I'm not going to give it to you, because you didn't call me as a daughter. You called me as a resource. Elena, what can we do? How can we fix this? You can't fix this, Mom. You can pay your rent on time, like any other tenant. You can make restitution for the money you stole, like any other criminal. And you can accept that the daughter you tried to control grew up to build exactly the kind of life that makes your approval irrelevant. I hung up without saying goodbye. Miguel found me an hour later, sitting in my office, staring at the phone. How do you feel? He asked. I thought about it for a moment, taking inventory of my emotions. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even particularly satisfied with the revenge aspect of owning their house. Free, I said finally. I feel completely free. Free from what? Free from needing their approval. Free from trying to bridge gaps they had no intention of crossing. Free from the version of myself that thought love meant accepting manipulation. Miguel sat down beside me and took my hand. Elena, I'm proud of you. Not for succeeding despite them, but for succeeding as yourself. For building something real with someone who actually values partnership over control. That evening, we walked through our neighborhood, the same Selwood area my parents had dismissed as beneath my upbringing. We owned 3 properties on our street now, providing homes for young families, veterans, and working professionals who needed affordable housing in a good neighborhood. Miguel, I said, looking at the houses we'd renovated, the families we'd helped, the community we'd become part of. Do you think they'll ever understand what they gave up? I don't think it matters anymore, he replied. Understanding requires being willing to see things differently. They're still trying to make you fit into their story instead of respecting the story you're actually living. He was right. They'd wanted to write my story for me, cast me in a role that served their vision of family success. When I refused to play that part, they'd tried to force me back into it through manipulation, theft, and emotional blackmail. But I'd written my own story instead. A story about partnership instead of control, about building instead of inheriting, about choosing love over social approval. 6 months later, my parents moved out of Westbrook Heights. They couldn't afford the rent on a house they'd thought they owned, couldn't maintain a lifestyle they'd funded through fraud, couldn't preserve a social status built on borrowed money and stolen resources. They never apologized. They never acknowledged the harm they'd caused. They never took responsibility for their choices or showed genuine remorse for their actions. But they also never asked me for help again. The last I heard, they were living in a small apartment across town, Dad working part-time consulting jobs, Mom taking on freelance bookkeeping work. They'd finally been forced to live within their actual means instead of the imaginary means they'd maintained through manipulation and theft. Highland Estates continued to grow. We expanded into commercial properties, established a construction division, created more scholarship programs. Miguel and I built something that lasted, something that mattered, something that provided security for dozens of families and opportunities for other veterans to build their own success. We never had children, but we mentored plenty of young people who needed examples of what partnership looks like, what building wealth actually requires, what love means when it comes without conditions or manipulation. Sometimes I drive through Westbrook Heights, past the houses we own, past the neighborhood where I grew up believing that love came with terms and conditions. The signs still say, Highland Estates, marking properties we've renovated and families we've housed. My parents see those signs too. Every time they visit the neighborhood they can no longer afford to live in. I wonder if they understand yet that their daughter didn't marry down. She built up. She didn't settle for less, she created more. But mostly, I don't think about them at all anymore. I think about the next property acquisition, the next family we can help with affordable housing, the next veteran we can mentor through starting their own business. I think about Miguel, who saw my potential when my own parents couldn't, who taught me that real security comes from building something together, rather than inheriting something alone. I think about the life we created based on mutual respect instead of control, on earned success instead of manipulated resources, on chosen love instead of conditional approval. My parents cut me off for marrying poor. What they discovered too late was that they'd actually cut themselves off from wealth they couldn't even imagine, the wealth of a daughter who learned to build her own security, define her own success, and love without conditions, and that, in the end, was worth more than any inheritance they could have offered or any approval they could have given. If this story resonated with you, if you've dealt with family manipulation or financial abuse, or if you're building something against other people's expectations, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Your story matters, and you're not alone in these struggles. And if you want to hear more stories about overcoming manipulation, building real wealth, and choosing your own path despite other people's limitations, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. There are so many more stories to tell about people who refuse to accept other people's definitions of their worth. Thanks for listening. And remember, sometimes the best response to being underestimated is becoming unshakable.